He was a man who knew how to guard a life, but not how to share one. She was a woman who feared the very touch he yearned to offer. In the quiet of a shared house, where a vow was a held breath and trust a mended scene, he would learn that the gentlest hands build the strongest home. Elias Thorne's life was forged in heat and silence. The sun that baked the single dusty street of redemption. Texas was a familiar weight, no heavier than the solitude that settled in his small house behind the smithy. Each day followed the same rhythm, a litany of iron and fire. The clang of his hammer was the only voice that answered his own. He rose before the sun, the floorboards cooled beneath his bare feet. He lit the lamp, its solitary flame pushing back a darkness meant for two. He made coffee, strong and black, and drank it standing, staring out the window at a world that did not ask for his company, only his work. His bed was made for one, the sheets pulled taut, the pillow bearing the impression of a single head. His table was set for one, a plate, a fork, a cup. The orderliness of it all was a bulwark against the quiet ache of loneliness, a fact he would never admit, even to himself. He was a competent man, an honorable one. He had been a scout, his eyes trained to scan horizons for threats. Now he scanned the small corners of his life for things to fix, for routines to maintain. It was a different kind of vigilance. In the evenings, the forge banked and glowing like a sleeping beast. He would sit in the one chair by his cold hearth, cleaning his tools or reading. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the turn of a page or the whisper of the wind through the dry grass outside. It was a peace he had once craved, a stillness earned after years of noise and violence. But peace had a way of hardening into isolation, and the quiet had begun to feel less like a comfort and more like a cage. He was a man of few words, because there was no one to speak them to. His hands, calloused and sure, knew the language of shaping metal, of mending what was broken. They did not know the language of a gentle touch. And so he lived, contained and stoic, his heart beating a steady, solitary rhythm in the deep quiet of a house too large and a life too empty. Elara Vance stepped down from the stagecoach, the hem of her dress immediately gathering the fine, ochre-colored dust of redemption. She clutched her worn satchel, the only thing in the world that was truly hers, and surveyed the town. It was little more than a handful of sun-bleached buildings huddled together under an immense, indifferent sky. She had come here for safety, for a respectable position as housekeeper to the new preacher. A quiet life promised in a carefully worded letter. But the man who met the coach was not the preacher. He was the mayor, a portly man with a nervous tic, and he delivered the news with an apologetic wring of his hands. The parsonage had suffered a fire in the roofing. The preacher's arrival was delayed by a month, perhaps more. There was no position. Not yet. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Elara's carefully constructed composure. She had spent her last dollar on the ticket. There was nowhere to go back to. As the mayor explained her predicament to the small assembly of town leaders, a man stepped forward, Mr. Sterling. He was handsome, dressed in a fine coat, despite the heat, his smile confident and proprietary. He owned the general store, the livery, and it seemed the town's goodwill. He offered her a room, a position in his own home. The way his eyes swept over her was not kind or charitable. It was assessing. It was the look she had traveled 500 miles to escape. "No," Elara said, the word small but firm. Her own voice surprised her with its strength. "Thank you, but I require a separate arrangement." Her refusal hung in the hot, still air. An insult, a problem. Then another voice, low and rough-hewn like old timber, cut through the silence. "I have a room." All eyes turned to the blacksmith. Elias Thorne stood apart from the others, his arms crossed over his broad chest. Dust and soot clung to his leather apron, and his face was unreadable, a mask of stoicism. He was a man built of iron and shadow. "It's clean." It has a lock, he added, his gaze meeting Elara's. It was not a look of pity, nor of interest. It was a simple statement of fact. A practical solution to a practical problem. Mr. Sterling scoffed, but the mayor, desperate to resolve the issue, seized the opportunity. It was settled before Elara could fully process it. She would lodge with the reclusive blacksmith until the parsonage was repaired. Her safety, it seemed, would be entrusted to a stranger in a silent house. As Elias led her away from the small crowd, carrying her satchel as if it weighed nothing, the first flicker of warmth was not comfort, but the searing heat of fear. Proximity had been forced upon them, a practical arrangement that felt anything but. The house behind the smithy was as silent and severe as the man who owned it. It smelled of wood smoke, soap, and something metallic that clung to the very air. Elias showed her to the room. It was small, Spartan, but impeccably clean. A narrow bed with a patched quilt, a washstand, a single window looking out onto a parched yard. "The lock works," he said, his voice a low rumble. He placed her satchel on the floor and retreated, leaving her in the quiet space. Elara stood for a long moment, listening to the sound of her own breathing. This was not the safety she had envisioned, but it was a door that locked. She would make it work. She was a survivor. Determined to earn her keep, she did not confine herself to the room. The next morning, she rose with him, though he made no sound. She found the kitchen, a space as orderly and solitary as the rest of the house, and set about preparing a simple breakfast. He entered as she was setting 2 plates on the small table, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway, watching her. The sight of another person moving through his kitchen, of 2 plates where there was always one, was a profound disruption. He said nothing, but he ate what she prepared. A silent accord was struck. He would go to his forge, and she would tend to the house. She brought a life into the silence that was not loud, but persistent. She washed the windows, letting in more of the stark sunlight. She mended the curtains, her needle moving with a quiet efficiency. One afternoon he returned from the forge, his chambray shirt torn at the shoulder, a long gash in the sturdy fabric. He was about to toss it aside, but Elara stopped him. "Let me," she said, her voice soft. He hesitated, then stripped the shirt off. The movement was fluid, revealing a cartography of old scars across his back and shoulders. He handed it to her, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through them both. She took the shirt and sat by the window, the afternoon light illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of careful repair. Elias did not leave. He stood across the room, watching her. He watched the concentration on her face, the way her fingers, so much smaller and more delicate than his own, moved with such purpose. He could feel the ghost of her work, the pull of the thread closing the tear, as if she were mending something inside him too. When she was finished, she held it up. The seam was nearly invisible. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. Later that evening, he found her by the window, a worn primer open in her lap, her brow furrowed in frustration. He walked to the pump, filled a tin cup with cool water, and set it down on the sill beside her, not saying a word. It was an offering, a silent acknowledgment. Trust was not a thing to be declared, but a thing to be built, stitch by stitch, cup by cup. Elara traced the letter B with her fingertip, her lips moving silently. The shapes were stubborn, refusing to resolve into the words she knew they held. She had taught herself the basics from a tattered primer her mother had owned, but progress was slow, a painstaking assembly of sounds that often fell apart before they formed a whole. The scent of iron and clean sweat announced Elias's presence before she saw him. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, his large frame filling the space. He had washed, his dark hair damp and combed back from his brow, his sleeves rolled to his forearms. He simply watched her for a moment, his gaze resting on the book in her lap. She felt a familiar prickle of shame, the flush of her own ignorance. Most women her age could read fluently. "The loop is the belly," he said, his voice quiet, startling her. He moved into the room, not close enough to be imposing, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He gestured toward the page. "It faces forward, like a man walking." He paused. "My father taught me that." Elara looked from the book to his face. There was no judgment in his expression, only a plain-spoken desire to help. She nodded, her throat tight. "B," she whispered, tracing it again. He pulled a stool over, the scrape of its legs loud in the quiet room, and sat near her. "Show me where you are," he said. It was not a command, but an invitation. For the next hour, as the sun bled orange and purple across the plains, he taught her. His voice, usually so sparse, was patient as he sounded out the words. His large, calloused finger, a tool that could shape unyielding steel, hovered just above the page, tracing the letters alongside hers. He was careful not to touch her, but the space between their hands was charged, a field of unspoken awareness. The scent of hymn soap, forge fire, and the clean scent of the man himself was grounding. It was the smell of safety, she realized with a start. Not the cloying perfume of Mr. Sterling, or the stale whiskey scent of the men she'd fled, but something solid, real. When the light grew too dim to see, she closed the book. "Thank you, Elias." It was one of the first times she had used his name. It felt significant, a stone dropped into a still pool. He gave a short, sharp nod, his face partially in shadow. "You learn quick." The next morning, she woke before him. The kitchen was his domain, the first fire of the day, a part of his solitary ritual. But she felt a shift, a small claim to the space she now shared. She met him as he came from his room. "May I light the kitchen stove this morning?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it was about more than a fire. It was a request for a key, a transfer of a small piece of domestic authority. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, and then he gave another of his brief nods. "Yes." He stepped aside, granting her passage, ceding a part of his routine. In that small exchange, another stitch was added to the fabric of their trust. She was not just a guest or a ward. She was a partner in the making of a home. The town of Redemption was a place where secrets went to die of exposure. The arrangement at the smithy was the subject of hushed speculation over clotheslines and store counters. Elara felt the weight of the town's gaze whenever she went to the mercantile for supplies. Mr. Sterling was always there, his presence a constant, low-grade pressure. He would tip his hat, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, and make a comment just loud enough for others to hear. "A delicate flower like you must find the smith's accommodations." Rustic. His words were a subtle poison, meant to isolate her, to remind her of her precarious position. One evening, as Elias walked her back from the store, a silent habit he had adopted, Sterling stopped them on the boardwalk. "Thorne," he said, his tone affable, but laced with steel. "A man of your reputation ought to be more careful with the ladies. People talk." He looked directly at Elara. A woman alone is so vulnerable. The threat was clear. Elias's body went rigid, his hand hovering near her elbow, as if to shield her. He said nothing, simply met Sterling's gaze with a flat, hard look until the other man's smile faltered and he moved on. The silence on the walk back to the smithy was heavier than usual. That night, the air in the small house was thick with unspoken tension. They sat in their usual places, Elara with her book, Elias with a piece of wood he was carving, but the space between them felt fraught. Finally, Elias set down his knife. "His talk can't hurt you here," he said, his eyes on the floor. "But it can follow you when you leave." He looked up, and the raw concern in his gaze made her breath catch. "My room," he said, the words coming slowly, carefully. "There is a cot in the corner." "I can take it," You can have the bed." He rushed on, as if afraid she would misunderstand. "For propriety, to quiet the gossip. The door has a bolt. On the inside, you would have control of it." He was offering her his own space, his own bed, while relegating himself to the corner like a guard. He was offering protection in the only way he knew how, by ceding power, by making himself smaller to make her feel safer. Elara looked at him, at this quiet, stoic man who spoke in gestures of service and offerings of space. He was not trying to get closer to her in body, but to offer her a fortress against the world's judgment. He was giving her the walls, the bed, the lock. She thought of Sterling's coercive smile and the vulnerability he had tried to weaponize. And then she looked at Elias, whose strength was a shield, not a sword. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. "I will take the bed." It was more than an agreement. It was a mutual choice, a deepening of the fragile trust they had built. That night, for the first time, they shared a single room. The sound of his quiet breathing from the cot in the corner was a strange and unexpected comfort. The bolt she slid into place on the inside of the door felt less like a barrier against him, and more like a latch on a shared sanctuary. The shared room changed the texture of their evenings. The silence was different now, softer, filled with the small sounds of two people breathing in the same space. Elara would read by the lamp on the bedside table, aware of Elias on the cot, the rustle of his blanket, the steady rhythm of his presence. His proximity was a comfort, a wall of quiet strength against the whispers of the town and the predatory gaze of Mr. Sterling. Sterling did not relent. His campaign was one of insidious charm and public pressure. He sent a basket of fruit to the smithy, a gesture of supposed generosity that felt like a claim. He would stop Elara in the street and speak of the future, of the parsonage, implying that once she left the smith's protection, she would need another, more suitable guardian. His visits to the forge became more frequent, always under the guise of business, but his eyes would follow Elara as she moved through the house. One evening, he arrived just as she was hanging laundry in the yard. Elias was at the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, a steady heartbeat in the background. "A woman's hands are not meant for such rough work, Miss Vance," Sterling said, his smile slick. He reached out and caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Allow me." The touch was a violation, cold and possessive. Elara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Let go of me," she said, her voice low and shaking with fury. Before Sterling could respond, the hammering from the forge stopped. The sudden silence was more menacing than the noise had been. Elias appeared in the doorway, his face dark with a controlled rage. He did not speak. He simply looked at Sterling's hand on Elara's wrist. Sterling released her immediately, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Just a bit of neighborly assistance, Thorne." Elias took a slow step forward, and Sterling, for all his bluster, took 2 steps back. He tipped his hat to Elara and made a hasty retreat. The encounter left Elara trembling. That night, in the quiet lamplight of their room, she finally spoke of the past she had run from. "I had an uncle," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "After my parents died, he was my guardian. He had a smile like Mr. Sterling's. He believed that because he provided for me, he was entitled to more." She didn't need to finish. The story was in the haunted look in her eyes, the protective way she wrapped her arms around herself. Elias listened, his face a granite mask, but his eyes were filled with a terrible empathetic anger. He sat on the edge of his cot, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He was a man who had seen the worst of the world, but the quiet cruelty of men like Sterling and her uncle was a venom he could not abide. He said nothing of comfort, offered no empty platitudes. He simply bore witness to her pain, his silent presence a testament that she was heard. She was believed. After her confession, the space between them filled with a new, deeper current of understanding. Elias looked at Elara and saw not just a resilient woman, but the survivor of a quiet war he knew all too well. The predator who smiled was often more dangerous than the one who snarled. A few nights later, it was his turn. The lamp cast long shadows on the walls as he sat on his cot, cleaning a small, well-cared-for knife. Elara watched him, the practiced, efficient movements of his hands. "You are good with a blade," she observed softly. He paused, his thumb testing the edge. "I was a scout for the army," he said, his voice low, pitched for her ears only. "My job was to see things before they happened, to be quiet, to be effective." He did not glorify it. The words were heavy with a past he carried like a shroud. "I saw enough. Men who used their strength on those who had none. I left when I realized I was becoming too much like them. Too quiet. Too effective." He looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw the ghost of the man he fought not to be. He was telling her why he lived in silence, why he kept the world at arm's length. He was showing her his scars, trusting her with the shame and the regret that were his constant companions. He held the knife out to her, handle first. "Every woman should know how to protect herself," he said, "not as a threat, as a tool. For your own agency." His voice was rough with an emotion he rarely showed. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. His fingers brushed hers as she accepted the weapon, the smooth wood of the hilt warm from his grasp. It was not a gift of violence. It was a gift of trust. The weight of it in her hand was the weight of his respect for her autonomy. In that moment, the last of her fear of him dissolved, replaced by a profound and aching tenderness. He saw her as an equal, a partner in her own survival. He was not protecting a fragile thing. He was arming a warrior. As she lay in his bed that night, the knife on the small table beside her, she watched the rise and fall of his chest as he slept on the cot. A yearning, fierce and protective, bloomed in her heart. He had given her a weapon, but the truest defense he offered was the unwavering honor that made him sleep on the floor, that made him offer her the hilt and not the blade. She was safe with him, not from the world, but within it. The confrontation, when it came, was not a clash of steel, but of wills. Mr. Sterling, accustomed to getting what he wanted through money and intimidation, decided to force the issue. He arrived at the smithy in the late afternoon, a sheaf of papers in his hand and two burly men from his livery at his back. He did not knock. He walked directly into the house, his polished boots loud on the wooden floor. Elara was at the table, practicing her letters. Elias was just coming in from the forge, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Thorne," Sterling began, his voice booming with false authority. "There's been a change in your circumstances." He held up the papers. "I've acquired the note on this property." The bank was more than happy to divest itself of a loan in arrears. It was a lie, a blatant power play. Elias's payments were always on time. "As the new owner, I'll be making some changes. First, you're out." He then turned his triumphant gaze on Elara. "Miss Vance, your services as a housekeeper will still be required. My home offers a much more suitable environment for a lady of your quality." He took a step toward her, his intention clear. He meant to physically take her arm, to lead her away like a purchased commodity. Elara's blood ran cold. But before he could touch her, she stood, the chair scraping back. Her eyes were not on Sterling, but on Elias. He hadn't moved. He stood by the door, his large frame deceptively relaxed, the rag still in his hand. But his eyes were like chips of obsidian, and they were locked on Sterling's approaching hand. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to raise a fist. The sheer, unadulterated force of his stillness was a warning, a promise of swift and terrible violence held in check by a thread of will. Sterling hesitated, his smile tightening. "Don't be a fool, Thorne. The law is on my side." This was the moment. The decisive, non-violent confrontation. It was not a test of strength, but of partnership. Elias felt the familiar, cold calm settle over him, the feeling that had preceded every fight he had ever been in. He could end this in seconds. A broken wrist, a dislocated shoulder. It would be easy. But he looked past Sterling, his gaze finding Elara's. He saw no fear in her eyes. He saw fire. He saw a partner. He gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. This would not be his fight to win for her, but theirs to win together. He held her gaze, a silent question passing between them. "Are you with me?" Her answer was not a word, but an action. Elara took a step forward, not behind Elias for protection, but to his side. She stood with him, shoulder to shoulder, a united front. She turned her clear, steady gaze on Mr. Sterling, her chin high. "This is my home," she said. The words were quiet, but they resonated with the force of an anvil strike. They were a plain vow, a declaration of belonging that no forged deed or blustering threat could undermine. Her home, not his house, but her home. The truth of it settled in Elias's chest, a warmth that spread through him, chasing out the cold rage. He had offered her shelter, but she had made it a home. In that moment, a profound shift occurred. He was no longer just her protector. They were partners. He slowly, deliberately, placed his hand on the small of her back. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of unwavering support. It was a public claim, a signal to Sterling and the world that they were a unit. The touch was firm, grounding, a silent echo of her spoken vow. Sterling saw it. He saw the finality in their stance, the wordless communication that passed between them. He saw two people who had chosen each other, and against that quiet certainty, his lies and his hired muscle were useless. A dark flush rose up his neck. Humiliated, stripped of his power not by violence, but by their unshakable bond, he crumpled the papers in his fist. "You'll regret this," he snarled, but the threat was empty. He turned and stalked out of the house, his men trailing behind him like chastened dogs. The door was left open, the late afternoon sun streaming in. The confrontation was over. They had won, not with a shout, but with the quiet, unassailable power of a shared vow. The moment the threat was gone, the adrenaline that had held them rigid receded, leaving a fine tremor in its wake. Elara looked down at her hand, surprised to find it clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She had been helping Elias by organizing a box of small nails and tacks, and in her haste to stand up to Sterling, she had pricked her finger on a sharp nail. A single perfect bead of red blood welled on the tip of her index finger. Elias saw it instantly. The larger battle was won, but his focus narrowed to this small, immediate hurt. The shift from silent guardian to tender caregiver was instantaneous. "Here," he said, his voice rough. He took her hand, his touch infinitely gentle. His thumb was calloused and wide, yet it brushed against her skin with the softness of worn leather. He led her to the wash basin, pumped fresh, cool water over her finger, and washed away the drop of blood. The simple domestic act was more intimate than any embrace. He was tending to her, his large, powerful body bent in an act of service. He tore a strip from a clean cloth and carefully, methodically, wrapped it around her fingertip. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his entire being focused on this small task, on her. When he was done, he did not immediately release her. He held her hand for a moment longer, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. "He will not bother you again," he vowed, the words a low rumble. She looked up at him, at the fierce devotion in his dark eyes. The tension of the last few weeks, the fear she had carried for so long, finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He did not wipe it away. He simply lifted her hand and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to her bandaged fingertip. It was an act of reverence, of aftercare. It was a promise that he would not only stand between her and the world's dangers, but that he would also be there to tend to the smallest of her wounds. He had protected her home, and now he was caring for her, the heart of it. In the quiet of the sunlit room, surrounded by the scent of iron and soap, Elara knew she had found something far more precious than safety. She had found a man whose strength was matched only by his gentleness. That evening, the house felt different. The lingering tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, resonant peace. The shared danger had forged a new level of intimacy between them, a bond tempered in a fire of their own making. Elias insisted on preparing their meal. He moved around the small kitchen with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch, his large hands surprisingly deft as he chopped vegetables for a simple stew. The aroma filled the small space, a scent of hearth and home that was deeper and more real than ever before. They ate at the kitchen table, the lamplight pooling around them, creating an island of warmth in the gathering dusk. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a comfortable shared space. It was Elara who noticed the smudge of ink on his fingers, a faint blue stain from where he had pointed out the letters in her primer earlier. Without thinking, she reached for the damp cloth on the washstand. "You have ink," she said softly. He stilled, watching her as she leaned across the table. She took his large hand in hers. His skin was rough, cross-hatched with the fine white lines of old burns and scars, a map of his life's work. Gently, she wiped the ink away. He did not pull back. He let her tend to him, his dark eyes watching her face in the warm lamplight. It was a mirror of the care he had shown her earlier, a reciprocal act of tenderness that sealed the unspoken pact between them. When the ink was gone, she let her fingers linger on his. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, his grip warm and sure. He then reached out with his other hand, and with a startlingly gentle touch, brushed a stray piece of ash from her cheek. His thumb grazed her skin, a whisper of a touch that sent a shiver through her entire body. It was the first time he had touched her face. It was a deliberate act of affection, of unguarded intimacy. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, the stew growing cool in their bowls. The world outside, with its dust and its dangers, had faded away. There was only the circle of lamplight, the warmth of their joined hands, and the quiet, certain knowledge that they were no longer two separate people sharing a roof, but two halves of a whole, finally at peace, finally home. The next morning, Elara woke to a soft, rhythmic scraping sound from the main room. She slipped out of his bed, which now felt like hers, and found Elias by the hearth, bathed in the pale morning light. The fire was not lit, but he sat on the stool, a small block of pine in one hand and his knife in the other. He was carving, his focus absolute, shavings of fragrant wood collecting at his feet. She watched him, unseen, for a long moment. He was a man of immense physical power, a man who could bend iron to his will, yet his movements were delicate, precise. He was not forcing a shape upon the wood, but revealing the one that lay within. When he was finished, he held it up. It was a small, exquisitely detailed songbird, its head cocked as if listening, its wings poised for flight. He blew the last of the dust from it and looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He had known she was there all along. He held it out to her. "A home needs a song," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing that held the warmth of the morning sun. She crossed the room and took the small bird from him. The wood was smooth and warm, fitting perfectly in the cup of her palm. Her fingers closed over his as she took it, and for a moment they stood there, connected by the small, precious gift. It was more than a carving. It was a symbol of the life he saw for them, a life filled not with silence, but with quiet music. He did not let go of her hand. He held it, his thumb stroking her pulse point. "Elara," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth was a vow. "Will you stay?" The question was everything. It was not an assumption or a demand. It was an invitation, freely given. He was offering her a choice, the one thing she had so rarely been given in her life. She looked from the songbird in her palm to his face, to the hope and the yearning she saw so clearly in his dark eyes. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the fear and the uncertainty, and the quiet, steady man who had offered her a lock, a lesson, a partnership. She smiled, a true, unguarded smile that made his breath catch. "I am home, Elias," she replied. The simple words sealed their future. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a silent affirmation of their pact. Later, they sat at the kitchen table as the sun filled the room, not as a landlord and a lodger, but as two people beginning a life. Two mugs sat side by side. On the mantelpiece, the small wooden songbird stood watch, a promise of the quiet, beautiful music they would make together.